Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, same to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières. Sandy Mossad from Glasgow town, he put on his kilts one day, down with the briny spray.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of our series of joint lectures held at the University of Wolverhampton, but generously supported by the Western Front Association. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to say that the third in the series will be Professor Brian Bond, here on the 1st of October, so actually very early in the autumn term. Well, one of the key debates which has raged this year concerning the centenary of the First World War has been the origins of the war. Slightly to the surprise of some of us, something which had a broad historical consensus for many years has once again become very contentious. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome this evening Professor Michael Neiberg to talk about a particular facet of the origins of the First World War, which I think actually rather unfairly has been missed out in some of the big debates recently. Now, Mike and I have actually known each other for probably about 15 years, a long time anyway. He's a good friend, an excellent scholar, particular expertise in French history, but that's not his only expertise by any means. And among his many works, my particular favourites are his book on the Second Battle of the Marne and a book on which theme he will be talking this evening, Dance of the Furies, looking at the impact of the First World War on the people who lived in Europe. And what I find particularly interesting about his work is actually, unlike many people, he doesn't stop when war breaks out. He then takes the story through into the early months of the war to look at the mentalities of people in Europe from the very top to the very bottom of societies right across Europe. So with great pleasure, I welcome Dr. Mike Neiberg. Mike.
Well, I want to thank Gary both for the invitation to be here at Wolverhampton today and for an introduction that, as they say in the United States, only a mother could believe. So thank you very much for that. I would really like to do two things here today. I want to present, first of all, some of the ideas from the book that Gary mentioned, and I also want to talk a little bit about what those ideas might mean for today as we're approaching this centenary and as we are suddenly, well, in my country, we are suddenly waking up to realize that there was a First World War and that in some ways this war was important, needs to be studied, and has not been studied. So while debates are raging in Europe about what the First World War means, in my country we are just starting to figure out that there needs to be a debate, and that's a very different kind of atmosphere. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about that. I work with U.S. Army officers and international officers right now, and what the centenary means has been a dominant theme. What should we be learning? What should we be knowing? And I think, at least in my country, we're learning and thinking the wrong things. And for the people that I work with, it's not simply an intellectual exercise. It means something for the way they think about policy and the way that they think about global crises today. So that's kind of what I would like to do here. I started with two images. The first is, these may be images quite familiar to all of you. They're not as familiar to my American students. The one on the left, for years I believed, was Gavrilo Princip being hauled off into prison. It's in every American textbook. It's either this picture or the kind of mugshot of him. It turns out that's not Princip at all. That is somebody that was apparently falsely arrested and then released the next day. The image on the right is one that I've actually had quite a bit of interest in for a long time. My wife did her undergraduate student exchange at the University of Strasbourg, and we spent a lot of time in Alsace and spent a lot of time in Strasbourg. And I was always taught in my French history classes that France got involved in this war to get Alsace-Lorraine back. And what I hope to show you here is that Alsace-Lorraine has nothing to do with why France is doing what they're doing. And I was told, and I don't know how many of you were told, that this statue, the statue of Strasbourg in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, was covered with black crepe at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and they only took the veil off in 1919. I went looking for any evidence that that's true, and I can't find any. So this is an image actually taken sometime in the 1890s, and there is, of course, no black crepe over it. So this is by way of saying that I think what we have done, we have subjected the First World War both to myths, which we'll talk about here in just a bit, and very simple historical realities. That is, it's easier to understand history if you take out most of the complicated factors. And at least in my country, I think that's what we're guilty of doing. So Gary, if I could lean on you to please turn the slide. So in 2008, when I started researching this book, it was actually kind of difficult to get people interested in the First World War in my country. It's always difficult to get people interested. And in fact, the idea that I had for this book, which became the book, a very reputable publisher, whose name I won't mention, but you would all know it, told me that was not the book that she wanted. What she wanted was a book that would be, I guess, like what Max Hastings did, you know, blame somebody and cause a big controversy and let's sell lots of books. And I said, look, I'm not really interested in doing that, and I'm really not interested in doing a book on war planning. What I was interested in doing was taking our perspective away from about 12 or 15 people that made the critical decisions that brought Europe to war in 1914, and to borrow a phrase from where I work, open up the aperture and see what else we might see if different patterns might come into play. And in 2008, I actually had a hard time selling that. I ended up with a fantastic press, and I'm very happy. Fast forward a couple of years, and all of a sudden, I'm getting all sorts of interesting phone calls and invitations to speak because, of course, the First World War is back in the news, in my country at least, and for three reasons. One is the historical analogies. Could I have a forward, please? The historical analogies that seem to crop up every time an international crisis begins, and I'll show you a few of these later on in the presentation. But it seems to me in the United States, at least, what we do every time something pops up, Syria, Ukraine, someone says, this runs the risk of being just like World War I. And it seems to me they don't actually know what World War I was. They're using the analogy to make a case about the present, less than about the past. Next, please. Of course, there are antecedents. Syria is difficult to understand without going back to the First World War. Ukraine may be a little more difficult, but I'm not an East Europe specialist. My East Europe specialist colleagues tell me you can do it here too. And then, of course, we have this magic moment. Forward, please. Thank you. The additional attention that the centenary is bringing, and this is an image of François Hollande, the French president, launching their centenaire, their 1418 centenaire. And my French colleagues, our French colleagues, are not real thrilled at the way that politicians there are using images of the First World War. And of course, I'm going to stay out of political discussions altogether, especially British political discussions altogether, but I know that there's been issues with British politicians and their use of the First World War here as well. So it's particularly important as we get into this centenary period here that we make sure we have the history right. If we're going to start making assumptions and we're going to start making analogies, it's really important that we understand what happened. So this is where Gary comes in. Gary has done probably the best job of anybody I know, slide please, of demolishing some of these myths. But here are some of them. At least these are what we do in the United States. I don't know if it's made it over to this side of the pond, but if it has or it's online, you should check out The Onion, which is a satirical newspaper run out of the University of Wisconsin, run out of Madison, Wisconsin. It's brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant. You can follow it on Facebook and Twitter. It's wonderful. This is from their desk calendar, My Dumb Century, Our Dumb Century. This was a Father's Day gift for my children. This is June 28, 1914, or whichever year the desk calendar is. This is the headline, War Declared by All. Austria declares war on Serbia, declares war on Germany, declares war on France, declares war on Turkey, declares war on Russia, declares war on Bulgaria, declares war on Britain. Ottoman Empire almost declares war on itself. And my personal favorite in the bottom right, Area Drunkard declares war on Ireland. The image, of course, being played out here is that this is a continent that went to war without really having any understanding of what it did. And as, of course, with all satire, there's something that it's building off of. But it's this kind of very simple, well, there's nothing really to learn here. These were just a bunch of confused, stupid people. And then the one that's near and dear to Gary's heart, I know. Gary's done more, probably, slide please, to demolish this one than anything else. The Blackadder notion of the First World War. And again, as comedy, it's fine as far as it goes. As history, of course, it's not so fine as far as it goes. And then an image that I know is quite popular here in the United States, but not, in the UK, but not as popular where I'm from, the Oh, What a Lovely War with John Mills as Douglas Haig. An image, of course, that came out on the 50th anniversary of the First World War. So another period where people are kind of reawakening, refinding all of these images. And I guess the key point that I would want to stress here, and Gary can speak on this with far more authority than I can, these images get fixed in people's popular perceptions, and it's very difficult to unfix them. And they get fixed for reasons that have less to do with history than to do with politics, and to do with, I guess, the politics of commemoration, a theme that there's been some really wonderful scholarship on lately. And again, I'm not going to say much more about that because Gary's in the room. And here I want to step particularly to an American focus for a little bit. The main way that Americans teach this war is through something we call the main theory of the war, the main reasons. I don't know, is this a British way of doing this or exclusively American? Yet another way we're behind. No?
I teach it to my students.
You do teach it? Yeah. Okay, hopefully by the end of this I'll have you not teaching it to your students, okay? I mean, I may not, but I'm going to give it a shot. This is certainly what I was taught about the First World War. This is certainly what I did teach about the First World War. I taught it when I taught an undergraduate course. I had 1500 to the present to cover. I had, even though I wrote that syllabus, I gave myself about 7 minutes to talk about the First World War, the outbreak of the First World War. And what I kind of discovered is that there's a 7-minute way to explain the outbreak of the First World War, and there is an entire semester way to explain the outbreak of the First World War, but there really is not much in between. So what this main system does, it has a nice mnemonic device to it. Main is very nice. Students can remember it, and it does present a kind of clear and in some ways comforting narrative to explain the outbreak of this war. What I'd like to show you, of course, is that we've simplified this to the point that it really, in my view, doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And then I'd like to show you what I think does make a little bit more sense. Also what this does, it takes away a lot of the blame for the war. That is, it puts the blame for the outbreak of the war on structural causes. So I think if you were reading Christopher Clark, you might find this a bit appealing. It doesn't really blame anybody. It blames processes. And the reason why I say it's comforting is because it tends to blame processes that we can at least believe in our own minds don't really exist anymore, or at least don't exist in the same way. So you can go to bed at night thinking, well, our world is not like their world. We're not as militaristic as they were. Our alliances don't work in the way that theirs do, even though they kind of do. The imperial age is over, and the great German theme of the centenary, the era of nationalism, is over. If you read the words that Angela Merkel said a couple of weeks ago when the Germans opened their centenary exhibits, this was exactly the main theme that she was talking about, that the European Union, other forces have taken away that drive of nationalism, so now we're okay. Now we don't have to worry about this. Okay? So Gary, if you could just... So this is the standard narrative, right? So you get the Prussians/Germans declaring the beginning of the German Empire in 1871 here at the Hall of Mirrors, of course, the same place where the Treaty of Versailles will be written in 1919. Then somehow you get Great Britain coming out of splendid isolation, and that leads us to people going to war madly happiest, deliriously happy, ready to avenge some ancient slight to national honor because they're militaristic, they have alliances, they are imperialist, and they are just imbued with this deep sense of nationalism. And I think, again, the reason why Americans in particular like it is it tends to depict Europe in the way that that Onion cartoon did, as a place of just irrationalities. And if you describe something as irrational, then you don't really have to study it. Then you can just say, well, they're irrational. They don't think the way we think. Now, fortunately, everything's okay. So we don't have to worry about this happening again. Okay? All right. Let's see how we do here. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to at least show you that these four things are not themselves pushing anybody into doing anything. So militarism is the first one. Even if you can get a definition of what militarism means, there are countervailing forces. I was just in France in February for a conference that marked this event. This is the Saverne crisis of 1913, a thing that is very big in France right now because we just had the centenary of it. This gentleman right here, this guy right here, is Lieutenant von Forstner. He is a 19-year-old Prussian lieutenant. He's 19 years old. I work with army officers. I work with guys in their mid-40s. 19-year-old lieutenants are not supposed to have a lot of power, right? You don't even give them a compass, right? I mean, right? Most dangerous thing in the world is a 19-year-old with a compass and a rifle, right? You just don't let them do anything, okay? This guy used the word Vacus, an Alsatian word, a very derogatory word to describe the locals in Saverne. In fact, the word is so offensive that the German army had banned its use in the late 19th century. It said that nobody could use it. Local Alsatians start to get upset about it, And instead of this lieutenant apologizing for what he had done, he tells his men, I will give you 5 marks for every one of these Vakas that you shoot, should any disturbance arise. Okay, and those of you who have served in the army, you know what you do with a 19-year-old who says something like this. Right? No, you don't shoot them, but you quite clearly tell them this is not the way that officers behave. Instead, the garrison at Saverne stood by him and said because he is a Prussian officer, he can stand behind the 1848 siege law, which allows him to outrank any civilian in the town. Okay. After that happens, you get this event. Von Forstner goes out to buy his daily bread at the local boulangerie with an armed escort of 7 soldiers. And in the days before Facebook and Twitter, this is the rough equivalent. Someone takes a photograph of this from their 3rd floor building, and it's soon going around newspapers all over Europe. Okay. Later on, this Lieutenant von Forstner takes the back of his saber and strikes a cobbler, a lame cobbler, on the streets of Saverne for not properly standing up and saluting him. The guy's clearly out of bounds, right? What the German army does is stand by him and say he's a Prussian officer. If he feels threatened, he can do anything he wants to do. All right? Militarism, right? Here's where I think it gets really interesting. This incident causes the only vote of no confidence in the German government in the history of the Second Reich. Almost everybody, except the hardline Prussian delegates, stand against the army. This is 1913, right before the war is supposed to break out. A Germany supposedly completely imbued and soaked in militarism. What the delegates say is, look, if you don't do something to this guy, we're not going to vote credits for the next army bill. It may have been a bluff, but this is what they're talking about. The Kaiser stepped in. I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want. And the Kaiser says, look, we can't have this kind of problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the entire garrison out of Saverne. We're going to move everybody out. But we're not going to punish the guy. Okay, and this crisis continues. I think he gets a light punishment. He ends up getting killed on the Eastern Front. I guess that is punishment, but that's a little bit later. My point is, what socialists are saying, 1913 to 1914, is, hey, this is in Germany and in France. Hey, we had this period of militarism, but it's clearly on the decline. Dreyfus Affair, Saverne Affair. They point to others. Romagna Affair in Italy, where the military is losing authority, not gaining authority. Or at any rate, it's not allowed to have authority above and beyond what is necessary to defend the state. Okay? This has been completely written out of the histories. But when you read the newspaper articles, even the American newspaper articles, which is what I've done most of, what the Americans are saying is, Germany is finally joining the community of nations. Germany's moving in the right direction. The Kaiser even saw it. The age of German militarism is over. We can argue that it's not, and this is all, window dressing or whatever. But clearly, there's some process that's countervailing here that's going on. And I can talk more about this. This is just the one example that I wanted to bring up. This is a statement from a French socialist newspaper. Again, please note the date, where they're talking about this. And they're saying things like, look, 1905, 1911, those 2 Morocco crises, those militarists really did have a lot of say in what went on. Fortunately, that's not the world we live in anymore. Things are getting better. And again, I think one of the reasons why the First World War is so deeply psychologically scarring to Europeans is precisely because they did not see it coming. Because this was so shocking to them. Okay, alliances. Okay, it is entirely possible to have an alliance structure in place and have it not lead to war. The Cold War proved that. It is also possible for alliances to be created that make the world more secure, not less. That's what these alliances are designed to do. Now, of course, they fail, but I'll just take the French one quickly, and I did put in the Lord Palmerston quote here, right, as a way of showing, think about those alliance systems. Oops, think about those alliance systems. England and France are allies. England and France. How long had England and France been at each other's throats? Right? You get people like Jean Jaurès, the French socialist, who are saying, look, if England and France can bury the hatchet, France and Germany can certainly do it. Right? This has been, England and France have been going on for centuries. And remember how that one begins, that alliance. It begins with a conflict at Fashoda, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, that later leads to peace. And Jaurès is an interesting case. What Jaurès argues, Jaurès is a French socialist, very left-leaning, who hates the alliance with Russia. Very right-leaning, conservative monarchy. Right? The French national anthem, he says, is about chopping the heads off of kings. It's not about kissing their you-know-whats. But even Jaurès says, an alliance with Russia makes Europe safer. And it's interesting, not because of Germany. An alliance with Russia makes France safer because if you have an alliance with Russia, the right wing won't do anything stupid. in France. Because if they're seen as offensive, Russia won't defend them. That is, the alliances are defensive in nature. The other thing about these alliances is that they're run by diplomats who have their own sort of way of doing things in Europe that nobody really understands. And I talk with my students about this a lot. You have a diplomatic crisis that flares up. The example I always use with them is something like the EP-3 spy plane incident in China in 2001 when an American plane and a Chinese plane clipped wings. Right? Things look like they're tense for a little while, and then somehow the diplomats figured something out and we go on, we worry about something else. Right? And then the cycle repeats, right? Without really knowing what anybody said. And again, you can see this in someone like Stefan Zweig, who I'm very pleased is back in popular culture with the Grand Budapest Hotel, the Wes Anderson movie that's just come out. Imperialism. I'm not going to mention his name, but a recent book that came out about 10 years ago, I guess, or so, arguing that imperialism caused the war. Well, I couldn't disagree with that more if I tried. Most imperial questions had long been resolved. Had long been resolved. Africa had been divided up in a way that certainly was cruel to the Africans, but resolved Africa as a problem for the great powers. The Anglo-Russian agreement is as much about Central Asia as it is about Germany. It's about solving that problem as much as it is anything else. And again, if you read textbooks that are trying to push this, what they will say, maybe you've done this in the teaching that you've done, the two great Morocco crises, right? The Panther crisis, when the Germans send the battleship Panther. I read that in a textbook once. The battleship Panther. This is the Panther. What do you notice? That's not a battleship. I used to do this when I was on a textbook buying committee. I used to go to the World War I section and read that first. And if I read something like, the battleship Panther or the war started because of the Kaiser's withered arm, no, we're not buying that book. I don't care what the rest of it says. Right? This is idiocy. Imperialism clearly did not cause this war. And then the one that I spent the most time thinking about, I guess, is nationalism. And to me, it's common sense. You can feel great pride in your nation without necessarily wanting to kill somebody of another nation. That seems to me prima facie. But the issue of Alsace-Lorraine is the one that keeps on coming back. And I had a lot of fun doing this, as the way that historians do. I went looking for anybody in France in the so-called July crisis. That is from, well, we call it the July crisis for a very good reason, but from June 28th until the outbreak of the war. I went looking for anybody that was talking about Alsace-Lorraine. I went looking for anybody. It's not there. What is there is a lot of countervailing evidence saying that this has nothing to do with what France is thinking about. So I just gave you a couple here, and there's a wonderful book written by a French historian named Jean-Jacques Becker. Becker went and looked at what are called instituteurs reports. That is, these are local French school teachers. When the crisis begins, the Central French government asks the school teachers in the countryside, report back to us, tell us what people are saying. Will they fight for France? What do they think the war is about? Right? Becker noted that 6% of those reports mentioned Alsace-Lorraine. And of those, almost half said, don't you dare go to war over Alsace-Lorraine, over those two German provinces. Right? What you get are comments like this one, 1912, so just before the war. I always like doing this too. This is 1912. There's a big worry in France that teenagers are unreliable. Young people are unreliable. They're selfish. They don't really think about anybody but themselves, as if this is somehow something new, right? So the Mercure de France goes around interviewing young Frenchmen. And one of the questions they specifically ask is about Alsace-Lorraine. And they say that statements like this are what are representative. Right? I do not think that this question interests the youth of the country of today or the country, nor does it interest me. Right? People are saying things like, look, they've always been German as far as I've known. Right? There's a very good book out, and Paul Jankowski has a new book out on the Battle of Verdun, and one of Jankowski's key points is, when you look at what the French and Germans are saying about the Battle of Verdun, no one's saying, we have to fight for Verdun because it's some ancient place where Charlemagne divided his empire. No one cares. No one's talking about it in those terms. Right? They're talking about it in strategic terms. Rail lines, fortifications. Right? David Starr Jordan, the former president of Stanford University, went to Alsace, spent a lot of time in Alsace in 1913. And granted, he was a pacifist with a particular kind of axe to grind. But this is the kind of thing that he wrote. No considerable body of rational men in either France or Germany desires war, would look upon it, war over Alsace-Lorraine, or look upon it other than as a dire calamity. What Jordan is saying is, look, what you should do with the city of Strasbourg is you should make it an international European capital so that it belongs to everybody. Right? Not bad. My favorite is from Rémy de Gourmand, the French writer, who said, I would not give the pinky finger of my right hand for Alsace-Lorraine because I need it to write. And I would not give the pinky finger of my left hand for Alsace-Lorraine because I use that to wipe the cigar ash off my jacket. Right? So I could talk more about Alsace-Lorraine, but I don't think that's what's going on here at all. In fact, hyper-nationalism is clearly on the decline. Okay, so you're probably asking me, what about this image on the right? A young peasant girl in Alsatian clothing. Actually, she's a Parisian girl. They put an Alsatian clothing on her. And the postcard says, "To Joffre, thank you from the bottom of our heart. To Alsace, you have finally given us back our happiness." Guess when this postcard comes out? October 1914, when French morale needs to be boosted back up. Right? This is not an image that you see before the war. So, Gary, please. So what happens? Well, what I hope to show you here is that the July crisis of 1914, and this is what does not give me comfort when I read the news, happens in large part because this crisis is different from the ones that came before. It doesn't fit the pattern, and people don't quite know how to react to it. Okay? And again, if a textbook says the First World War began because a Serbian teenager shot the Archduke and his wife, I'm not buying that book either. Right? The shooting of the Archduke has nothing to do with this. I mean, nothing directly to do with this. Right? The first reaction of most people is sympathy, okay, we're sad that they're gone, and then actually relief. Because Franz Ferdinand had been a particularly controversial figure. Or it was, I don't know who the heck he is. Right? I think it's H.G. Wells I quote in the book. He finds out that the Archduke's been assassinated in Sarajevo. He and whoever he's sitting with open up an atlas to figure out where Sarajevo is, and then they close it. Right? This is not a big deal. It's sad, but it's not a big deal. Again, I think Stefan Zweig had it right. Only a few weeks more and the name and figure of Franz Ferdinand would have disappeared for all time out of history. I think he's right. It's not the first assassination in Europe. Certainly not the last assassination in Europe. But there's something different about this one. And here's what I want to show you. Here's what's different about this one. How am I doing here? I think I'm all right. Okay. Gary, slide, please. This is wonderful. I have a distinguished scholar turning slides for me. This is unbelievable. Okay, what I would like you to note about these four crises, and I just picked out four here. I'd like you to notice two things about these diplomatic crises that Europeans had seen before. The first is that they're all very lengthy crises. They all take months to work themselves through. The second thing is every single one of these crises is resolved peacefully. And in fact, the Fashoda crisis, which I alluded to earlier, which is between Britain and France to control the headwaters of the Nile River in what is today the Sudan, actually leads to the Entente. So there's a way in which this diplomatic crisis works out not only good, but really good. Okay? Every one of these works out peacefully. Could you give me the next one, please? And the next one, please. I know we're not in Manchester, we're in Birmingham, but seems to fit, close to Birmingham, seems to fit absolutely perfectly. Right? Diplomacy will have all the time needed to localize this latest Balkan war, which is what they think it is, where it belongs. And the French refer to the Austro-Serbian crisis, or the Danube crisis, right up until the last minute. Okay? This is what Europeans are expecting. 4, 5, 6, 7 months, and at the end, the diplomats will have figured something out and we'll go on with our lives. This is what they think is going to happen. And again, why they're so shocked when it doesn't happen. And again, think how fast the time schedule is compressed in this case. The July crisis, the real crisis here, is not June 28th, the shooting of the Archduke. It's July 23rd when Austria-Hungary delivers that ultimatum. Right? So it's about a week. It's about a week. And then again, you see things like this. This is the Petite République. We praise the calm attitude of Germany, of France and Germany, who still watch with folded arms and sword in sheath. And this is typical of what you see. You see French newspapers saying, look, everything's fine. It doesn't really affect us. This is a Balkan problem. And it doesn't matter anyway because President Poincaré is with the Germans right now. They're working everything out, or some such story. Right? The diplomats are going to handle this. The conservative system is going to handle this. Slide, please, Gary. And then again, just the main thing I want to just highlight here is the speed. Just how much faster this is going to go and how disorienting that is for Europeans who really can't figure out what's happening. And you can see this, and I have some examples in the book where someone will say, look, the morning newspapers, everything looks bad. It looks like the crisis is going to get serious. Oh, no, the afternoon papers say that everything's okay. Right? And then the cycle repeats. The interesting one to me is July 28th, the International Socialist meeting, which takes place in Brussels. It was already ongoing. It was already happening. They don't discuss the diplomatic crisis. They don't talk about it. In fact, what they say is, if there's still a problem in late August, when we meet in Vienna, we'll talk about it then. In other words, this is going to draw out, just like everything else does. And of course, by the time they meet in Vienna, Humpty Dumpty is broken. And again, Edith Wharton, the American writer, this is July 31st, by which time the train has already left the station, metaphorically, well, and really. War, of course there couldn't be war. The cabinets, like naughty children, were again dangling their feet over the edge. Right? But again, something's going to happen. They'll come back off the edge. They're not dumb enough to actually do this. So, what is different? Here's what I think really is different. This crisis is different for the senior leadership in Vienna. And it's different for the senior leadership in Vienna for an interesting series of reasons. This is the first time in a very long time that the Austro-Hungarians look like the victims, not the perpetrators. Remember the 1908 Bosnia crisis, right? Austria had been the big bad bully in the Balkans. Now they are the victims of what we would today call an act of state-sponsored terrorism, even if they can't quite prove it. And I know there's still a debate about the exact complicity of the Serbian government. Right? Nevertheless, they know that they're the victims. And if they're the victims, they're going to get a little bit more diplomatic leeway than they would ordinarily get. And exactly what that's going to mean, nobody quite knows. Second, because this crisis does not affect France or Britain in the least, Austria can expect that those two countries will move slowly. And remember, Great Britain is concerned, when Britons talk about the war or the coming war in this time period, they're not talking about the Balkans. They are, of course, talking about Ireland. Right? And France is distracted, too, by a wonderful, wonderful scandal called the Caillaux scandal that I can talk about if you want. It's absolutely brilliant. Right? This is another one that you see in books a lot, that the French were running daily special editions in the newspapers in late July. That's true. But they weren't special editions about the Balkans. They were about the trial of Madame Caillaux, the original trial of the century. Okay. They also calculate, incorrectly maybe, that Russia might stay on the sides because Russia had not defended Serbia in 1908, number one. And number two, the Russians, most of all, are not going to stand up for someone that kills kings. It's the thing they're most afraid of. And I can talk about a few other things that are going on here. The bottom line is what the Austrians look at, this is a circumstance that might never come for them again. The stars may never line up like this again. Okay? And for various reasons, the Germans are making a similar calculation. Again, Britain and France are out of it. The Austrians, who they don't have a whole lot of faith in, if there's going to be an international crisis that Austria is going to go all in for, this is it. This is it. Right? The point I want to make is that it's not structural, what's happening in 1914, largely. I think it's contingent. It's this peculiar set of circumstances that is leading the Austro-Hungarian elite especially, and the German elite kind of right behind them, to push things further than they would have ordinarily. The problem is this is not the crisis they were ready for. Right? I don't think this is apocryphal, but maybe Stephen or Gary can correct me. This is exactly why the Kaiser turns to Moltke, his senior commander, that guy right there, and says, mobilize in the east only. And the Kaiser says, Moltke says, we can't do that. And the Kaiser's brilliant answer, your uncle would have given me a different response. The same thing's happening in Russia. Right? The Tsar says, look, mobilize only on the Austro-Hungarian frontier. Germany's not involved in this. Leave Germany out of it. Same thing. The Russian generals say to the Tsar, we can't do that. We have to mobilize everything or nothing. Right? This is the thing that to me is the most frightening. The civilian leaders who are making these decisions really have no idea how their own militaries function. They don't know what they're designed to do. They don't know what their plans are. As much as the Kaiser loved being in uniform, and you've all seen pictures of him with the helmet with the dove, and then the dove is wearing the helmet, right? That man did not know what his own army was designed to do. Right? That, to me, especially working where I work, is a little bit scary. So, again, widening that aperture. Slide, please. I apologize for all the text on this slide, but I really wanted to make the point. These are both occurring on July 30th. So you've got a German and a Frenchman saying almost exactly the same thing on almost exactly the same moment. To people that are going to be involved in this war in Britain, France, Germany, which are the three countries I studied the most, I think you can make the case for Austria too. Russia may be a little bit harder. Believe exactly this. Somebody else started this war. Right? And the educator in me, the guy that reads a lot of papers in me, started counting the number of passive voice constructions you would start to see. Things like the Kaiser statement. The sword has been thrust into my hands. Right? This is Christopher Clark imagery, right? Nothing, it just sort of happened. Right? I think it's Bethlen Holweg who's asked, how did this war start? And his answer is supposedly, God, I wish I knew. Right? What I think is happening is that these guys are playing a diplomatic game, and by the time they realize what they've done, it's too late to stop it. By the time they realize all the disconnects in their thinking, it's too late to stop it, which is in some ways more frightening than the structural response. So from this, what you get are these things. And the one I really like is the one on the right, Le Bonnet Rouge, which is a syndicalist newspaper. It's as left-wing can get. Just before the First World War, they had printed an editorial in which they said, the only place fit to fly the French flag is on top of a dung heap. The same man who wrote that when this crisis begins, I think he's 71? He's not a young man. He says, I will be ready to pick up my rifle and fight for France. Why? Because he thinks that France had nothing to do with this. He thinks the aggression is coming from somewhere else. And I think he's right, by the way. If you're French, it's perfectly legitimate to believe, as the Bonnet Rouge believed, that France did not have anything to do with this. Germany's a more complicated case. Russia mobilizes first. That's important. It allows the German people to believe that what they're doing is defensive. So some of you may know the story, but Jean Jaurès comes back from that socialist meeting. He realizes that things are further along than he thought, that there really is an international crisis. He demands to meet with President Poincaré, who's center-right, a man that Jaurès had not had a particularly good relationship with. He meets with Poincaré. He hears Poincaré's side of it. He goes to meet with friends of his at a cafe, and he tells them if we socialists were in their shoes, we would have done everything the way that they did it. And then a few minutes later, he's assassinated in that cafe. And at the funeral, Poincaré says, no matter what disagreements I had with Jaurès, in this situation, Jaurès would have known how to do his duty. In other words, this is a defensive war, which even in socialist thinking is a just war. And I can talk more about this in a little bit, if you want in the Q&A. Right? If you're a German socialist, it does no good for socialism to let the Russian Cossacks run through Berlin. Right? It's a just war if it's defensive. So we get statements like this one of my absolute favorite documents that you come across. When you come across something like this as an academic, this is something that you just know you're gonna want to use it. This is Katie Kollwitz, perhaps best known in World War I terms for this memorial at the grave of her son Peter in Belgium. The German government commissioned her to come up with a piece of art for the grave. This is what she came up with. It is two parents mourning over their dead child. Right? A really remarkable piece of commemorative art. This is a letter she wrote to her sister in September of 1914. This is early on. This is early on. This is just weeks after the war began. And I'm going to read it because I think it's just so powerful. She says, one cannot hold on to any illusions anymore. And I think what she's referring to here is the illusion that Germany was acting defensively and that the real threat to Germany had come from Russia. Right? And again, those of you who know your First World War history know, although the Germans say they're doing this because Russia mobilized first, 7/8 of the German army go not east but west. And that's hard for people like Katie Kollwitz to understand. If the threat was Russia, why did we invade Belgium? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Nothing is real but the frightfulness of this state, which we almost grow used to. In such times it seems so stupid that the boys must go to war. The whole thing is so ghastly and insane. Granted, this is a woman whose politics run to the left, not as far to the left as they will after the war. Right? But this is not a woman saying, wow, I've always felt really German. It's going to be great to have Frenchmen get killed. That's not what she's saying. Here's what she is saying, though. Occasionally comes the foolish thought, how can they possibly take part in such madness? But they must. They must. In other words, what Katie Kollwitz has figured out very early on is that this war is not really going to have strategic objectives that are negotiable. Right? This is going to become a total war really fast. What you're actually fighting for are ideals. As Hugh Strachan calls them, the war of big ideas. Right? You're fighting against an enemy that you believe had perpetrated an illegal war. Right? All right. So what does this mean? I'm almost done, I promise. What it means is we have got to get this image of Europeans being eager for war in 1914 out of our heads. It isn't there. It isn't there. I might replace it with what I might call war determination, which is a different thing from enthusiasm. In other words, Europeans are determined to fight. They are determined to defend their territory, but they're not doing this. I did not come across a single document. I'm German, French, Russian. I've always waited for my chance to go kill a Russian, Austrian. Now I finally got it. That's great. No one's talking that way. I think this is why the process of making peace is so difficult. When you get to the end of a war like this, it's very difficult to figure out terms that are negotiable. Right? You're not fighting over control of Saxony. This isn't really about the Saarland, right? Which makes finding peace so difficult. I think it's also why Woodrow Wilson appears so messianic for a while, because he is talking about big ideals before it becomes obvious that his ideals are not going to work. All sides, again, I'm going to leave the Russians out of this because they're a little harder for me to get a read on, and I don't have Russian. But all sides in 1914 are talking about this war as defensive and moral. I think, though I can't prove it, I think the states that hold together the best are those states that can most easily make this case. So Britain, France, these are states that believe they're in this war for purely defensive and moral reasons. The states where that logic comes under pressure, Austria, Russia, even later Germany, are the states whose political consensus comes apart. I can't prove that, but it probably has something to do with Lloyd George and Clemenceau as well. And again, I don't want to carry this too far, but I think World War I is the cause, not the effect, of the nationalist hatreds in Europe. That is to say, I'm not denying people felt nationalistic in 1914. I'm not denying that. I don't think that nationalism caused them to want to kill people in another nation. However, 4 years of total war, a revolution in Germany, the Black and Tans, whatever you want to throw in there, the Freikorps, whatever you want to throw in there, the Russian Revolution, the Russo-Polish War, created enough hatreds to fuel not just the First World War, but I would argue the Second as well. I'm not sure yet about the claims of some of my colleagues that this war really doesn't end until 1989, though I'm sympathetic to the argument. Again, you read things like this as an historian, right? A wish for us all in 1915, may this new year make up for 1914 and bring us peace. And of course, you know that that's not going to happen. So let me start to bring this to a conclusion by talking a little bit about the present. I think this is just a small sample of things that I pulled off the internet recently. The most famous has been Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, who has been very upfront about saying that China is like Germany. It is a rising power. John Mearsheimer, the American political scientist, has made this case too, that Germany is like China. It is a rising power with what Mearsheimer calls excess capacity for power, that, like Germany in 1914, will eventually get exercised. Japan, in this analogy, or in Mearsheimer's case, the United States, is the offshore balancing power that is trying to balance out that rising power. And Mearsheimer has gone so far as to argue that in a situation like this, violence is inevitable. Well, you can probably already guess where I'm going with this. I don't think that's what caused this war. So therefore, if you accept Abe or Mearsheimer's arguments, you may actually be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy the other way. Right? Another interesting point about 1914, it may well be the case that it's not rising powers that are the problem for the international system. In the case of 1914, the biggest problem in the international system is the declining power of Austria-Hungary. And they all talk about it. Better to fight now, the Germans talk this way too, than to wait a few years when our relative power will be lower. It may well be the case that it's not the rising power that is the problem, although as Philomena and I were talking about, most historians are not real comfortable with these international relations theories models, right? Because we understand that Germany and China simply aren't the same thing. And 1914 and 2014 simply aren't the same thing. Right? As I tell some of my colleagues who are international relations theories, history only gets easy if you choose to throw out most of it. right? If you consider all of it, it gets a lot harder. But you see things like this. The Syria dilemma. We don't want it turning into another Sarajevo, right? I don't know what George Packer was talking about, but he said, my God, it feels like August 1914. I sort of get it. He's talking about an era where powers are rising and powers are declining, and there are terrorists out there and non-state actors out there. Okay. I take the point as far as it goes. Again, Angela Merkel begins her speech on the Ukraine with the First World War, that Europe must recall in this year an ill-fated kind of politics. Right? Every crisis is becoming the First World War. But if we're taking the wrong history and understanding the wrong lessons, then we run the risk that the policy implications will be wrong. So it might well be, so let me give you 3 things that it might actually be about in 1914 that we're not talking about. One of them might be what the United States Army calls the Thucydides trap, and I'm pleased that enough people are reading Thucydides to understand what this means. The way the Americans use it, the Thucydides trap means that great powers actually don't end up going to war for their own interests. They end up going to war for the interests of a minor ally. And the reference here is to the Peloponnesian War, where the war between Sparta and Athens actually begins over a conflict between 2 client states. So some political scientists, John Mearsheimer's also been on this, has argued that American military commitments to places like Taiwan, Japan, Israel run the risk of sinking us into one of these traps. Okay, that seems a better one to me than the one Abe has made. The second one, and I talked about it a little bit, is how dangerous it can be when the military is thinking of a problem in one way and the civilian leadership is thinking of a problem in another way. And I was asked at one point to talk about the relationship between them, and I did something that was totally off the cuff, but I kind of like it. These guys in 1914, Gary and I had a problem with the computer here. They're thinking of their generals kind of like tech support guys. We've invested a lot of money in you, and we have a problem. We don't want to know how you rewrote the code. Solve the problem. Fix it. That's the way they're thinking of this. In the same way that Gary and I didn't know how to rewrite the code to fix the computer problem we had. It's a bad analogy, but I like it. And I work with soldiers, and they like it, so I'm going with it. And the third is, people are reacting very often to the situation that they're seeing with the wrong information. That is, they're not going back and questioning their central presumptions, which is something we also talk quite a bit about where I work. How do you know what you know? How do you confirm that what you know is right? Okay, so last slide, please. This was from the New Yorker magazine as well. I'm not really sure I get it, but obviously it's on somebody's mind. Someone pulls off their 2013 wall calendar, and behind it is not 2014, it is in fact 1914. Okay. I'm an historian. I'm kind of trained to look at things in similarity and differences. Are there things I see that look kind of like 1914? Yes. Do I think this is 1914? No. No. So I guess I would really stress 3 things. Focus on contingency, not prediction. What I mean by that is that main thing or any structural thing you want to talk about, history is not destiny. It was still the critical central decisions made by central figures. Right? And we need to understand why they made those decisions the way that they made them. It's not about withered arms. It's not about Conrad's desire to marry his mistress. It's not about any of that. Right? It's about the history they were living through and the way they were seeing things. I think we want to be very careful with historical analogies. I know every historian understands this intuitively. But there's a lot of use of the 1914 analogy that just doesn't make a lot of sense. Right? It's used to make a political point, not an historical one. And third, I guess, the thing that we all would do, I guess, as historians, understanding the past conditions reactions to the present. And there's a wonderful book called Analogies at War, in which the scholar for that book looked at how American policymakers in 1965 looked at the declining situation in Vietnam. If they looked at Vietnam as another Munich, they tended to react policy-wise in one way. If they looked at it as another Dien Bien Phu, they looked at it in a very different way. And in his view, the single most important determinant of how American policymakers looked at American policy options in 1965 was not party affiliation, it wasn't their age, it was which historical analogy they clutched back to the most. And he did a really interesting thing with this book. He looked both at what they were saying in public and then, of course, what they were saying in private. And they're, of course, very different things. In 1965, very few people were saying this is another Dien Bien Phu, at least in public, because of the obvious place where that analogy leads you. Okay? So understanding the past, whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious about it or not, the way we see the past conditions the way we're going to view the present. And in that way, I would argue, the First World War is not just an arcane century-old thing that we ought to be commemorating. It's something we got to understand if we're going to deal with the world that we live in today. So I'll end on that and take your questions. Thank you.
No had no chance to shine in Cupid lamp until the day the solid spied a stranger in the camp. Ooh, Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, same to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right under the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières. Up in his aeroplane one night when Robinson for the flight, everything all right, beautiful moonlight night, circled around the moon a while its wonders to explore, looping the loop above the clouds and watching the sinking door. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, time to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières.